What the future holds in store for the people of Earth. Excerpts from the 691st Official Contact Conversation of October 20, 2017.
Today I want to mention what has been bothering me recently, because I had two visions, and I have made some probability calculations. This, however, is a process different from that of all the prophecies and predictions which originate partly from as long ago as the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s and are also found partly in the book Prophetien and Voraussagen. A great many predictions mentioned in this book, as well as many other things which I have made predictions about in open letters and bulletins, have since then actually come true and are happening now, as also will continue to be the case in the future. But I also have something else related to the future which I have calculated according to my two visions, and if, in my detailings and explanations, I talk about government powers, that is rulers and politicians, as well as the miseries, which predominate among these dealings of government, then without exception this has to do only with the fallible among these state leaders and their mistakes. And I say that because I am always well aware that there are actually some among the governing powers, rulers and government officials who are good and dutiful people and who do their best to fulfill their obligations to their best abilities. I am also well aware that the state laws, statutes and ordinances are entirely justified and in general are in due order, so there is nothing to be done of a negative sort against them, as is also the case with the just and upright governing powers, government officials, rulers and politicians. So naturally my statements, explanations and assertions are to be understood to refer only to those immoral and unjust governing powers, government officials and politicians who solely exercise their offices for personal gain, and not for the well-being of the people or for the sake of law and order, liberty and peace. I further protest only the false, anti-human and anti-peace as well as illogical laws, statutes and ordinances, etc. And in no way do I mean all that which is right, good and effectively necessary in regard to law, order and ordinances, and everything which falls under this category of rectitude in regard to laws, statutes and ordinances as well as government leadership, etc., permits the human beings to live in appreciable peace and liberty and also to enjoy a certain security, as is at least the case in Switzerland. But nowadays that is somehow no longer self-evident given the ever-worsening felonious criminality, the ever-increasing criminal activity and the ever-broadening scope of terrorism, as well as the dreadful rise of anarchism, which is unfortunately ignored by those in positions of responsibility, as well as the growth of religious and racial hatred, the generally growing dispeace and the upset of families, and the matter with the humankind of Earth is that, well, they're simply all going nuts, because honestly everything they do is completely idiotic, because the more people populate the Earth, the more are reproduced and brought into the world, and the more the scale of the overpopulation increases, the more counterproductively reduced and restricted become all the public services, as is the case for example with the administrative services, which also demand ever more fees for any and all and even the littlest services, so that also the bureaucratic war gets ever more complicated. Additionally, the public bus services and the state and private train and traffic services and the transportation connection possibilities are ever more drastically restricted, while the prices for the usage of such services is getting ever higher. Also, the train stations and traffic stations and post offices are being demolished, as well as banks and bank affiliates, which, for their supposedly customer-friendly management work, demand ever higher fees. Even hospitals and medical practices, etc., are getting ever more frequently liquidated, while all the remaining ones demand incredible costs of the patients and regularly exploit them as a matter of course. This also occurs in the same form with the heads of companies, shareholders of firms, bosses, professional athletes, especially footballers, and boards of directors, etc., who demand ever more immense so-called wages, so that individually these wage earners get paid sums in the millions, which go up to over 10 or 12 million Swiss francs annually. This while the normal worker, depending, makes about 3,000 to 4,000, or in better positions up to 10,000 or 12,000 francs or euros are dished out, even though these are generally the ones working harder, while the big mouth bosses just laze around in their fancy chairs and hardly lift a finger, only busy at bossing people around. Everything only serves to steal large financial means and to amass fortunes deceitfully. These repeatedly re-elected, autocratic rich people also take labours to be elected as popular leaders in the governments, where they then financially oppress the people all the more by exploiting them with all kinds of taxes, be it with value-added taxes or commodity taxes, etc., because all that matters to them is leeching out the citizens through taxation, and getting themselves undeserved massive wages and later being able to pocket retirement money for the rest of their lives. This while the rest of the population, who have to eke out their livelihood for low wages, are required to pay huge taxes till they are too sore to lie down. And not even older people are spared from this, who have to live on paltry retirement funds or pensions or have to vegetate away, as even the government pensions are taxed their pound of flesh, for which reason they have no choice but to live in poverty and cannot afford to meet their basic needs. So what else can one call them but a government rat pack and criminals, who arrogantly and arbitrarily keep on inventing new taxes, in order on the one hand to exploit the taxpayers, and on the other hand in order to fill up the government's coffers, so they themselves can pocket huge wages and later pensions, which amount to a lot more than the average person makes through actual hard work. And to be clear, I don't mean by this verminous rat pack and government criminals the justly governing and just and fair government officials, but only those who exploit the people and abuse their positions in order to repeatedly rob the population with new taxes and administrative and governmental duties, in order to fill the coffers of the administrations and governments and themselves to pocket huge wages and live in prestige and plenty, able to afford all they want, while the labor sector are not so well off at all, and the poor have to waste away in their poverty. And that is unfortunately the case in Switzerland, like in so many other countries, in which certain unscrupulous people in government, as imperious elements with no oversight or reckoning from the good people in the rest of the government, do whatever they want in order to financially exploit the population with new taxes and fees, and to enrich themselves with unearned wages and pensions, whether it is through nationwide direct or indirect taxes, through high transportation fees and highway tolls in general, and it's particularly unfortunate that the good people in government are silenced and thwarted by these conscienceless elements who are enemies of the people, who are only elected on account of their populistic tricks, or that they let themselves be influenced and persuaded by these to participate in such people exploiting machinations. And this is a real plague, which has seized everywhere and spread worldwide, not only in the governments but also in the non-official and non-governmental and practically in every private and economic sector, as is the case with post offices, doctors, hospitals, care work, and other care organizations, banks, dentists, firms and trades, etc. The whole mess is not just criminal, but is lawless, because through all this financial criminal and conscienceless as well as money-grubbing elements constantly snatch larger and larger fortunes, impose themselves over the worker class, take control of them and practice an out-of-control lawless capitalism, which the labor force, RISP, the men and women effectively working, have no choice but to submit to and be preyed upon by the capitalist sharks. Of course, that is hardly understood by the collective working people and not even by the populations in general, So everything continues in this miserable way, and the whole workforce becomes ever poorer, ever worse, underpaid and repeatedly exploited, and does not even defend itself against these crimes, while the big cheese capitalists and other millionaires and billionaires get ever richer. And to top it all off, the good people in governments and administrations, who know better, do nothing whatsoever about it, but only go along with it all, which however can only happen because the citizens and populations also allow everything to take place, without defending themselves at all against these unfair circumstances. And they behave so passively and foolishly on account of their blind faith in their administrations and governments, because they are slaves of blind faith in authority, and moreover cannot think or act for themselves, but only let the administrations and governments think for them, and so are little more than their lackeys and servants. And since that is the case, the citizens are no longer free people at all, but politically controlled serfs of administrations, governments and parties, who possess no civil courage at all, and allow themselves to be beaten into submission like skulking hounds, with ever less freedom and self-initiative. The people of today have become completely lacking in intrinsic initiative, so they don't bother to defend themselves at all, or only in the most demanding circumstances, when they have nothing left to defend. And if it actually happens that they wake up out of their lethargy, then they lose control and reason, go berserk and rage around in such a blind rage that they just try it and do more harm than good. With their intellect and rationality turned off, only blind hatred and boundless rage can enter the picture, which cannot be brought to its senses, because at that point any thinking capacity, insight and cognition, any wisdom, any sagacity and any capacity of good judgment is thrown on account of raging brutality, resentment, dissatisfaction, vengefulness and hostility, etc., such that one only any more behaves in a rampaging and fanatical frenzy. One can only hope in this state that, after the inevitable Ausartungeon, at least something or other remains in them, and that finally intellect and rationality prevail, so that, with much work and effort, order and progress can again be begun. But one has to consider the fact that the small clique of power-hungry people, the mega-rich and capitalistically fortunate, to whom the world practically belongs, on account of their financial power, can no longer rule it. If that happens, then it must be reckoned that the whole populations of the earth will no longer be governed by capitalism, but that in the future the people will determine global affairs in true democracy and will regulate everything such that for all people in every respect there is equality, and indeed also in regard to the wages, so that no longer must the one person waste away in poverty while the other one is filthy rich and gets to live in prestige and plenty. For that to happen, however, requires that people wake up from their slumbering lethargy, start to think for themselves and avail of intellect and rationality, in order also to put a stop to the disastrous globalization, which, because of capitalism and especially the capitalist head honchos, has gotten so bad that nature itself is affected and revolts against it. So, the entire terrestrial population the entire humankind must at last learn to think independently and clearly, and not let the authorities and political parties or the capitalist powers think for them, but endeavor to think independently and for themselves. Independent thinking requires one to seek out and collect information from various sources, in order then to compare these and draw one's own conclusions. Independent thinking is not only preferable, but must be a duty of the human being, so one should expect it of oneself, and this really has to be learned already early on through the upbringing and then through one's self-education, because only thereby is it made possible to form one's own opinions. It is unfortunately the case that a great many human beings, even after they have grown up, are fully incapable of forming their own opinions, because they have never learned to think independently. And these people are also incapable even of adding their inputs on for them central issues, or rethinking these and forming their own opinions about them. Consequently, these people are also incapable of questioning the opinions of others, but simply take these on themselves mindlessly and live in the delusion that these opinions are right and are their own. But people who are incapable of thinking independently are also entirely incapable of recognizing independent thinking as such, because for them this is really non-existent, but instead only a product of assumptions from extrinsic and regurgitated thought. Recently I had two visions of the coming future about this, which were very shocking and have shaken me up. So I have pondered deeply all that I witnessed and the coming consequences, and have also carried out probability calculations about what the hell is going to happen in the future, and that to me looks really bad, not just bad but absolutely catastrophic, and leads to a future Armageddon. Accordingly, I've compiled everything which predominantly is correlated to the rapidly rising overpopulation, which inevitably will cause, through its ever-worsening ramifications, ever more catastrophes in the whole world. This was also foretold by prophecies which are contained in the book of Prophecies, and foretell the gigantic wildfires in the USA, where for many years now terrible wildfires have occurred, which have burned up whole towns and parts of cities as well as rural areas. This is indeed presently the case, as a huge wildfire with fire tornadoes has devoured several towns and already burnt down over 6,000 dwellings, along with other buildings and forests. But what I have calculated is probable in regard to the insanity of the overpopulation for the coming time itself poses, if everything occurs as I predict, an enormous and unprecedented catastrophe for humanity. But yet more terrible consequences will issue from the whole mess, which I want to describe, which will result, according to my visions and calculations, after the biggest catastrophe for humanity, if, under certain circumstances, a huge extermination of human beings takes place, and if it really happens, it will be orchestrated and carried out by the government powers and capitalist elites. Thus, proceeding from the results of my probability assessment, which in some cases has about a 34% probability, but at most around 56%, which however can increase, yet even these probabilities present the danger that this possibility may occur. These percentage-wise outcomes already present the possibility that the whole mess, when it really gets worse and indeed takes place, that is becomes reality, will be so utterly monstrous in the future that everything is practically inconceivable for the average person and they will not be able to cope. So, I will describe everything which I have calculated to be likely according to my two visions, and I'll begin with what will then be the ultimate consequence. If my visions and probability calculations come true, then I'll talk about the various factors which altogether lead to the ultimate consequence, which then will be inescapable, if the human beings do not quickly make a turn for the better, in order globally to implement a birth stop and birth rate control, and also democratic civil governments. Additionally, however, all the bad people in government, administrations and politics must be removed from their posts, and replaced by actual good powers who are loyal to the people, who fulfill their offices for the good of the citizens, that is democratically, and perform all functions of government according to the will of the people. But what I have to say, which I have calculated the probability of, speaks of a quite all-encompassing matter at hand, which I have already written down, because the whole of it would be too much to remember it all. So I can read it off from my computer and present my findings from my visions and probability calculations, which are: Vision 1. The great misery and the end of the overpopulation crescendo will be that the global elites will realize that they can only guarantee the retention of their power by drastically reducing the population, and this reduction of humanity threatens to be implemented in the future in a lawless manner by these world powers, if the mass growth of the population is not stopped beforehand by means of a drastic global birth stop and a global birth rate control. The world powers RUSP, the governmental mighty, the people rulers and the capitalist powerful, who as such form a global elite, which overall is also strongly religious sectarianly involved, as will remain the case in the future, will, in the manner of their actions, be much, much worse than the war crimes and human rights crimes that took place under the Nazi regime. Vision 2. The future globally powerful elite will show no mercy at all and will carry out an extermination of human beings, which could not be more terrifying, and that may occur, according to probability calculations, in a variety of ways, such as for example that various old deadly plagues are cultivated and prepared with new deadly agents, but also that artificially cultivated diseases can be used to decimate humankind. The calculations also point to the possibility that infectious biological materials will be used secretly for the decimation of humanity, and that their lethal effects will be presented to the public as new and incurable plagues, whereby the toxins permeate the entire organism via the respiratory tract and the mouth or also through the skin or mucous membranes, so that inescapably, unstoppable mass die-offs occurred, also belonging to the arsenal for decimating humankind to a governable size are such things as intentionally provoked famines and wars and poisoning of the food and drinking water, which will take place worldwide, thus not only in a few murderous and dictatorial states. Also to be considered a possibility is that a thermonuclear war will be used to depopulate their human mass, in order to reduce them so that they can again be governed, so indeed also in that way, a mass murder of people's rasp. A murder of humankind can take place on an unprecedented scale.
But before all that happens, my probability calculations predict the following dungeon to arise.
1. All over the world there are already very complicated changes taking place, and these will broaden in the future in their scope, which is governmental, political, capitalistic, military, economic and civil, brought about by the power plays of incompetent people, who, through their wrong decisions, incompetent economics, claims to power in other countries, oppression of the liberty and peace in many respects in their own states, etc., have provoked cause for revolt. 2. The states, small and large, in the entire world, shall equip their militaries with modern weapons on an unprecedented scale, as a result of which, rather than peace, liberty and security, the whole mess produces ever more the danger of conflicts with neighboring states, so skirmishes and wars. 3. All over the world, there will be serious attacks on police organizations committed by anarchistic groups from the populations, which will cost human lives, along with a rise in acts of vandalism and destruction of government property, which ultimately may even lead to military operations against these groups, when the security organizations can no longer handle them. 4. Alongside the USA and Russia, China now also makes a name for itself in global geopolitics, and thus abandons its traditional position as a passive observer, which it has practiced since the Korean War, thus becoming a confident superpower and world power and a blooming new Chinese nation with an impressively growing economy, so that the Socialist People's Republic of China no longer makes any bones about its ambitions as a leading power and superpower, and in every respect shall also military arm and equip itself to a large extent. 5. The refugee problem will continually grow worse in the future, so that ultimately between 250 and 350 million people will leave their homelands as refugees and disperse all over the world. In particular, Europe will make matters worse as a consequence of the refugee mismanagement perpetrated due to the stupidity of pseudo-humanitarian rulers and popular groups, who advocate and bring about the whole thing, so that also new griefs and diseases are introduced and unrest will be stirred, so that also hostility toward foreigners and hatred of other races and religions and sects, as well as criminality, all increase in magnitude. 6. The coming times bring many technological advancements, which shall provide humanity with benefits as well as cause them harm. Nature and its fauna and flora, RISP. The entire ecosystem and the climate shall be ever worse damaged by the out-of-control lawless activities of human beings and their ramifications of overpopulation, and undoubtedly due in part to the idiotic advocations of this environmental destruction by the governments. Not only are the mighty of the governments, the rulers and the politicians responsible for this, but also often the militaries and the lobbyists, private stakeholders, populists and all other manner of involved riffraff, who manage to infiltrate the governments with their rising power and their dirty fingers, and contribute to the broadening destruction of nature, its fauna and flora and the climate. In total, it will come about that the threshold will be broken, which could have prevented a great deal of harm arising from Mozartungen, indifference, hatred, dispeace and envy, etc., as terrible natural consequences of the growing overpopulation, so that from the ramifications thereof there will be awful wars over resources between the states which inevitably involve skirmishes and wars. The rapid technological development as a phenomenon of the progressive 21st century will be greatly underestimated in its negative potential, because it will carry great dangers, through which ultimately the future of humanity itself as a whole and thus, also future generations will be gambled with. 7. All over the world, various states will evermore fall into civil unrest, because civil and separatistic disturbances shall arise in them, which lead to severe domestic and economic revolts, riots as well as violence and uproar. 8. As has been the case for a long time, in the future the delusional believers in God will become entangled in mutual hostilities and hatred, and not only the believers in the various religions, but also the sects, so that for this reason conflicts of belief and belief-based terrorism shall ignite and herald a wave of malignant dispeace, hatred, wars, massacres and displacements, suffering, hardship and misery for humanity. And that shall keep happening over and over again, as long as religions and their sectarian offshoots continue to exist and reform themselves. 9. The governmental and state powers and politicians, of whom a good portion are already acting in a populistic manner, wherein are also involved the lobbyists, evermore succumb to diverse forms of populism and attain power by means of populistic agitations, deceitful promises and with lies, lead the populations into confusion and, through their misleadership, into plight, hardships and despair as well as into unregulated, order-destroying and state-endangering situations, such as in Europe, along with Switzerland, where unfortunately various populists and lobbyists are permitted to wreak havoc to the detriment of the rights and freedom of the citizens, also Germany and naturally the EU dictatorship, as well as especially France, England and Holland and also Austria, shall deprive the peoples of their rights on account of the machinations of populists and lobbyists in the governments and among the politicians. So also they will be misled to accept new fees and taxes whereby they are financially exploited, as they will continue to do in the future. 10. The popular media of all kinds will also degenerate ever more into a populistic instrument of power, through whose intrigues and plots the populations will be populistically influenced and manipulated, such that, as the fault of the media and their power, false information that serves their shady interests shall be propagated and mislead the people. 11. Populistically made up and manipulated conspiracy theories and mendacious reports will be produced ever more frequently and mislead the populaces of all countries and make them into believers of all those who make a huge profit with these conspiracy lies and exploit the people and control them thereby. 12. The political perils increase ever more, as is also the case with humanitarian concerns, the economic problems, the entire management of the people and economy and business, as well as the great danger presented by wars and the international perils of terrorism whose threats to security play a significant role. 13. The present and soon-to-come global situation is so hazardous at this time that it is already much more perilous in various ways than it was at the time of the Cold War, and shall only escalate further. 14. The main culprit of all the coming terrible, negative and dire changes through meddling in foreign countries' domestic and foreign affairs, events, procedures, conflicts and problems, etc., is the world power-addicted USA, which, mad with power, as it has been for a long time, increasingly meddles in the domestic and foreign political issues, matters and interests of other states, and thereby provokes unrest, dispeace, wars and other skirmishes. 15. Painstakingly established and secured positive alliances, connections, accords and treaties between various states and organizations, etc., are partially or completely broken and fall apart, and the USA has a lot to do with this, thus, provoking time and again hostilities between countries and great insecurity, unrest, dispeace, revolutions and the danger of wars breaking out. 16. The USA and the rulers of the USA shall be imperiled in the future in many ways, which rise from both governmental and non-governmental anti-government and anti-state actors, as well as from large parts of the United States population, so that the US population breaks up into different population groups, the basic causes of which are already present, so that the USA is already separatized into various groups at the present time. 17. Evermore, new hostilities are arising between different states, which shall lead to political and economic conflicts and to terrible and destructive wars and skirmishes. So a fourth world war must ever be considered a distinct possibility. Again, the main culprits for this are the criminal and lawless global dominance and global police aspirations as well as political machinations of the USA. 18. All over the world, various states are approaching the brink of collapse in regard to the public law and order, and a climax of the bad circumstances in regard to security shall rise domestically and extraneously through extreme terroristic and military as well as dictatorial machinations. 19. Russia will, despite preventive measures by the government, become the target of terrorists, so that especially Islamist attacks shall emerge from the autonomous regions of Dagestan and Chechnya. 20. The nuclear powers will, out of power hunger and in order to preserve their power status, wage nuclear wars, in addition to deploying other weapons of mass destruction and thus wreak global havoc which results in suffering, death, misery and annihilation across the whole planet. 21. Natural resources will become such rare commodities that states will provoke and wage unbridled wars in order to obtain or keep them, so that as an egregious example certain superpowerful nuclear powers will unscrupulously make use of their deadly weapons. 22. The prosperity of all humankind will be threatened, as already now, however in the future the threat will be terminal, through the authoritarian tendencies of the elites among the ruling classes, politicians, populists and capitalists, so that inevitably also signs of social collapse shall show themselves as a consequence. 23. The terrestrial humanity will establish the most unscrupulous and life and humanity disregarding systems of rule and government that have ever existed, so that those exercising ruling power, the possession-greedy and capitalist powers shall steer the ship of humanity from one catastrophe to another. 24. Terrorism, whether religious, sectarian, political or anti-people and anti-state, will become as out of control and prevalent as the deadly and destructive terror attacks of all kinds which claim human lives and wreak enormous destruction all over the world. The entire global terrorism will grow ever more frequent and become a living nightmare for the humanity of this planet. 25. The political perils all over the world grow ever worse and threaten through political instability to provoke all manner of armed conflicts as well as to degenerate into wars and acts of terrorism, so that also in this form the out-of-control peril of terrorism shall rise viciously and push the world to the brink of collapse. 26. The unremitting growth of the population and the whole mess of economically mismanaging systems of all kinds, and in all sectors, will globally drive up the number of unemployed and reach forms that will provoke enormous problems, like never before has been the case during previous times of mass unemployment. 27. In the whole economy, the wages of the employed will drastically decrease, and provoke enormous financial problems in all population strata of the working world, so that also the social collective is damaged, shall collapse, and everywhere a rapid rise in criminality shall also engender enormous problems. 28. Speculators will bring about a global financial and economic crisis of such proportions as has never before been seen, so that the whole financial economy falls into terrible straits, and also very much trouble and great scarcity of commodities occurs. 29. Even in the USA, the people will be dispossessed as a consequence of the global financial crisis, which shall become a pretext for deploying the military and police forces against the angry and partly also heavily armed population. 30. The planned ban on cash shall elicit the dispossession of the population, while however the elites of the ruling classes and of capitalism shall enjoy great opulence, as if they were swimming in a pile of money, and the whole financial system the world over will be overturned, in order to redistribute the extant national debts of all countries, so that in general it costs all populations of all states. There already are secret plans in the USA and EU dictatorship to start a war from Germany against Russia, which shall then be blamed for the whole ensuing global crisis. And that the war should be blamed on Russia, of course completely unfairly, if it actually happens, that is obvious from the start. And if this war should actually happen, then it will be used as an excuse to enact martial law which will suppress the riled-up population, who by then will be fully dispossessed, with mighty and reckless military and police forces. 31. Even now there exist countries that are in truth only so-called nominal states, and which are effectively not independent states at all, but exist as such in name only, and really have no state power of their own. These are in fact fundamentally just unenforced regions which are teeming with criminal organizations and are ruled by guerrilla warriors and warlords. Even Europe is a place rife with criminality and lawlessness, which is also ruled by the EU dictatorship, which itself is an extremely dangerous dictatorship, which contributes much to the instability of international geopolitics, and is also as base of operations and even a plaything of international terrorism, from whom in the future the threat of military force will emerge. But the EU dictatorship is also a source of criminal and lawless machinations by criminals and lawbreakers, and shall be a yet greater source of such lawlessness in the future, such as drug, human and arms trafficking, so that the longer this lawlessness persists, the less can any kind of law and order be enforced. 32. There will be attempts to dispossess the people of Greece, as shall also befall other states. 33. The retirement institutions will no longer be able to pay pensioners, because they will want the financial means, and on the one hand due to the increasing age of the pensioners, on the other hand because there are ever more of them because of the growing mass of the overpopulation, so that also in general the costs of living increase and also the needs of pensioners, whose raise or even payment at all shall become ever more doubtful. 34. Many states shall be driven into financial desperation by illogical financial expenses and charges, so that the whole structure of the states and banks as well as the economy shall collapse due to inevitable bankruptcies. 35. Globally, all social systems will collapse, so that ever more human beings suffer in abject poverty, cannot afford health care and even die of starvation, because they cannot any more sustain themselves, nor afford food and the costs of health. 36. Independent and sovereign states will in the future be treated as the highest threat and as enemy of the USA, so that, as has been the case for a long time, Russia, from the delusional perspective of the USA, will be variously proclaimed as the biggest threat to American security ever more often. 37. The USA shall evermore continue to bring immense stocks of the most modern terrible weapons into Europe, which they shall continue to station in Germany and in the countries bordering Russia, so that Russia does not simply accept this situation and builds up its nuclear arsenal, all manner of conventional weapons, as well as the Russian army and the whole Russian forces. 38. Even now there are not merely two world powers, the USA and Russia, as there are also various regional powers, some of which are nuclear-armed and have international aspirations, of which the most significant one is the AU dictatorship, but after that also Brazil, India, Japan, Nigeria and South Africa. These all increase the global insecurity for all states, as all are arming themselves more and more, and not merely for defensive purposes, but also in order to prepare for attacks on neighboring states. 39. All over the world, the populations of many countries shall become ever more discontented with the emerging miseries of the states, and rise up in revolt, which brings about the danger that civil wars should break out. 40. The ruling classes and the financial powers, who carelessly and falsely, as well as elitist, power-hungrily, selfishly and imperiously domineer over the populations, will have to fear for their lives and be forced to protect their life and their possessions, which will only any more be possible, if at all, if they employ bodyguards or even paramilitary troops. 41. The elites of the ruling classes and the money power will, together with corrupt politicians, create global totalitarian and dictatorial surveillance states, in order to preserve their power and status. 42. The financial world promotes capitalism ever more, and the whole shall degenerate in a nationalistic form RUSP, a fascist-type way, in order potentially to nip any other emerging systems that oppose capitalism in the bud.
Your visions and probability calculations agree with ones I performed myself 3 decades ago and which can well come true, if nothing improves and corrects itself in the entire terrestrial world politics, the forms of government, the entire economy and in the overall behavior of the peoples of the terrestrial humanity, as well as in their intellect and rationality. And what must be done in order to achieve this improvement and correction? One thing is intrusive rules for a very quickly implemented and carried out worldwide birth stop and a decisive birth rate control, in order to restore the humanity to a planetarily and naturally sustainable level, which for Earth is 529 million individuals, while however in the event of a decimation of the terrestrial humanity, a number between 1 to 1.5 billion will be determined, as my own probability calculations of 3 decades ago indicated. My probability calculated however of course, being performed 3 decades ago, showed lower outcome possibility percentages than now, namely only around 47.7% at that time, which however since then have increased massively. I have not performed any looks ahead in performing these calculations, but my probability calculations make clear, as yours do, that they in fact show a certain increased predictive possibility of occurrence. This will however grow larger if, in the political, economic and general global events, as well as in the general overall behavior of terrestrial human beings concerning their intellect and rationality, everything is not significantly changed for the better and no progressive and logical patterns of behavior and actions come about, which may guarantee a healthy continuation of the terrestrial human species.
That is interesting to me, as I did not know that you have also made such calculations and that I arrived at similar results with my calculations as you with yours. To me, that must mean that both our calculations have a rather high chance of coming true. But let me return to the topic of what I have calculated in regard to the likelihood that in the future the peoples will not be governable by the government powers and the capitalist elites. As I have calculated, the beginning of all this was already created several decades ago, and in order to recognize and understand that fact, one need only look back into the 19th and 20th centuries, the course of which large and governmentally uncontrollable criminal organizations came into being, which hold immense power and even exercise this power in the workings of government. It is however also to be mentioned that the governmental leaders largely only anymore disregard the interests of the peoples, and that there is already such a discrepancy between the rulers and the people that a settlement cannot be reached between them, and everything can only get worse than it already is. And the whole gamut of political parties contributes to this problem, in that they are divided amongst different interests instead of being linked together in a unanimous logical, peaceful, intelligent and rational as well as progressive and beneficial common interest.
I see it likewise.
So, we agree. And what I want to say in regard to the disorder prevailing for a long time now in all states is that criminal organizations play a particularly ignominious role in all this, whom neither the security services nor the police, etc., nor the administrations, government powers and militaries can do anything about. The brutalist gangs criminal organizations of the world are all marked by violence, power, murder, human and drug trafficking as well as homicide, every possible organized criminality and actually also completely out of control religious sectarian fanaticism, about which nothing has been able to be done in a legal and just way for the past 200 years or so. Most of these gangs and criminal organizations, which are not merely criminal but effectively lawless and do not hesitate to commit any crime, were not merely established in Central and North America, in order to defend ethnic interests, but also in Europe, Arabia, Asia, and in particular China and Japan. Since then, their influence has uncontrollably expanded and greatly increased, such that their brutality, ruthlessness and consciencelessness, murdering and killing as well as their unscrupulousness and their viciously out of control violence have proliferated all around the world and constantly increase in prevalence, whereby the terrestrial humankind is ever more checklessly tyrannized. Such lethal criminal organizations did exist a long time ago, and these continue to crop up again and again, but since the beginning of the New Age in the year 1844, they have become ever more prevalent and ever worse, even in regard to their torture, murder, killing and violence techniques, to which our new techniques and methods are being added and used. In part, these criminal organizations have worldwide networks and therefore terrorize not only certain countries, but all states on earth that they can, so that, on account of their splintering into various branches, one cannot seriously combat them, as is the case for example with the religious sectarian political terror networks Al-Qaeda and the Islamist State, both of which, as global forms of transnational terrorism, have large parts of the world in their sights, and which to bring about a change in the international economic or ruling order with terrible tortures, violence, murders, killings and destructions. And that also will remain the case in the future, even after ISIS has been defeated in Iraq and Syria, as the crime against humanity committing Islamist State ISIS, as well as Al-Qaeda, have so extended their tentacles throughout the entire world, established themselves all over and split off into various other groups that it is no longer possible to get a clear view of them all, and it is also no longer clear which original terrorist organizations they derive from or are to be grouped with. One thing however is certain, and that is that behind this terrorism is a religious sectarian madness and fanaticism, which exacts the blood and death of innocent people on account of their belonging to other religious beliefs or other social groups, or other peoples and cultures. Along with that, however, there is a whole range of other forms of terrorism, such as for example national terrorism, which is restricted in its aims and sphere of action to the territory of a particular state, as is for example the case with the Maoist movement in Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Indonesia and the Philippines, and as also was the case with the RAF, Red Army faction in the German Federal Republic. There additionally exists international terrorism, which also has domestic, interior goals, but whose sphere of action also stretches beyond national boundaries, so that also uninvolved third persons become victims of it, as is the case with the Filipino terrorist organization Abu Sayyaf. But, concerning terrorism, there are yet many more forms, for example social revolutionary terrorism, right-wing terrorism, ethnic terrorism, nationalistic terrorism, homegrown terrorism RISP, domestic terrorism, conservative vigilante terrorism, vigilant equals on guard, etc., social justice terrorism, on account of a sense of injustice, state-sponsored terrorism and eco-terrorism. Yet there is also a wide range of other forms of terrorism, of which there are too many to list them off. But also to be mentioned are the gangs and criminal organizations which are known worldwide, such as the Mafia in Italy and the USA, Yakuza in Japan, Hell's Angels, the Triads in China, the Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, Aryan Brotherhood in the USA, Crips in the USA and Canada, and also the Blood Alliance RISP. The Bloods in the USA, among many, many others. The whole matter is in reality quite awful,